Hello and welcome back to the Sinobabble podcast. So I need to start this episode off with a confession. I love K-pop. I am aware that I am a grown woman and I am aware that K-pop is just basically mass-produced, same-sounding garbage pop music, but I just love it. As a millennial woman who grew up in the 90s, it fills that void that was left bare by the NSYNCs and Backstreet Boys and Spice Girls of the world. And I love it despite knowing everything about the industry. You don't need to leave me a 3-paragraph essay explaining all the reasons why K-pop is bad. I am aware that it promotes negative beauty standards that encourage young women to get plastic surgery that they don't need. I'm aware that it makes girls who are 90 pounds soaking wet feel like they need to lose weight to fit into the industry standard. I am aware that it puts a lot of pressure on the individuals who are often underage people working for slave wages or often no wages at all, and I'm aware that they have the most toxic fandoms in the world that often drive people to suicide. But despite all of this, I cannot stop consuming K-pop. And it's not just K-pop, it's K-dramas, it's Korean reality TV, it's Korean movies, and I'm sure that you have seen at least one Korean media project in your life. If you haven't seen Squid Game, which is one of the most watched TV shows in the world, you may have seen Parasite or another Korean movie or a movie produced by a Korean director. Korea's cultural media sensation, the K-wave, Hallyu, whatever you want to call it, is one of the great phenomena of the 21st century. In her book, The Soft Power of the Korean Wave, Parasite, BTS and Drama, Yoona Kim explores the rise in popularity of Korean culture, writing that the Korean wave was originally initiated by the export of TV dramas since the late 1990s, and it has become more visible through creative intersections with K-pop music, film, animation, online games, smartphones, fashion, cosmetics, food and lifestyles. It should be noted that most of this, if not all of this, is essentially organic growth. The online participation of fans in actively translating and spreading and promoting this culture, the fan culture that's grown up around not just K-pop idols, but Korean celebrities in general, Korean fashion brands, Korean cosmetics, and even Korean food, and the way that Korean food is consumed, for example, through media like the mukbang, i.e. eating food on camera for views, which, I mean, everything has an audience, right? This organic growth and the promotion by fans is what has led ultimately to the success of Korean culture, and has helped spread its influence even further into basically normie culture. The Korean wave is not simply a planned flow that originates from Korea and transnational corporations, but more by accident. It's a multi-directional flow and a highly interactive collaborative process that is created and possibly sustained by digitally empowered fan communities. The global expansion of the Korean wave can be attributed to the power of digital fans' participatory culture and the effective labour in prompt uploading, remixing, forwarding or sharing with wider audiences while shaping the reproduction, circulation and reception of the Korean wave. Popular culture, which was once considered an emotional and low culture in Korea, is now a potent global force providing significant underpinning for the generation of high value and meaning for the nation. As a pronounced example of the crossover of culture, economy and politics, the Korean wave is seen to be an integral resource for the creation of a dynamic image of the nation through soft power, the ability to attract and influence international audiences without coercion. So I start with this to ask the question, why don't we consume Chinese media like we consume Korean media? Why does China not have South Korea's soft power? It's a larger economy. It has more people, more resources, more land, greater influence on global affairs, and arguably Chinese culture is part of the genesis of Korean culture in general. China is often seen as the originator or nexus of a lot of East Asian cultural norms and practices, things like hierarchical societies based on Confucianism. So why has China's rapid growth in hard power not translated to a similar growth in soft power? What's the relationship between the two? What is the point in soft power? In fact, what even is soft power? I think if we start with a sort of colloquial view of soft power, it's kind of used among the people to define how cool a country is. I think a good proxy in the popular imaginary would be something like, do you want to go there on holiday? Do you dream of living there? Do you want to work there in the future, maybe? How attractive is the country in general to the member of another nation? In this sense, a lot of countries have a completely outsized soft power in comparison to, say, their economic power or their military power. If you think of a place like Italy, which has spent all of its skill points on Riz and being cool, to the extent where people can overlook the fact that it is being run by either corrupt businessmen or proto-fascists pretty much from the late 20th century up until now. No one hates Italy. Nobody has beef with Italy. Even Jeff Bezos is getting married in Italy. But Italy has no economy. Italy has no economic power. It has no military power to speak of. Italy is just kind of there. It's got its cool tourism, it's got its cool history, it's got its cool culture, it's got its nice food, and that's pretty much it. If we go back to the example of South Korea, the rise in Korean culture and media popularity is basically what has generated interest in wanting to live, work, or move to Korea. It's what has led to the rise in the study of Korean language. The portrayal of Korean men in dramas has contributed significantly to the rise in attraction towards East Asian men, and a strong focus on popular culture and consumerism has allowed most people to overlook very significant problems in Korean culture, such as the fact that the presidents either tend to be cult members or aspiring dictators. I don't have time to go into it right now. Also, this is not a Korean history channel, but if you head over to another YouTuber called Kurzgesagt, they have done a video on why South Korea is doomed. And what's most interesting about that video is the millennial Koreans in the comments just being like, yep, that just about sums it up. Like, our country is doomed, our government doesn't care, and there's nothing that we can do about it. And yet, foreigners are still willing to move and work to Korea, even knowing of the dangers of, say, not having equal rights, of discrimination against foreigners, against women, just generally having a knowledge of all of these problems, right? So from a societal perspective, having good soft power allows people to basically overlook aspects of your culture that are not so good, which is something that we'll be coming back to. From an academic viewpoint, soft power can also be equated to a sort of coolness, but it's more like a geopolitical coolness. How much of an influencer are you on the geopolitical stage without having to flex your economic or military might? The original definition of soft power comes from a man called Joseph Nye, who is also one of the people who is responsible for formulating the concept of neoliberalism. And he coined the term soft power in a 1990 paper by the same name. And in this paper, he's essentially trying to explain the transition of power from the 20th century to the 21st century, and how the decline in US power overall doesn't necessarily mean that the US is going to not be a future leader on the global stage. He argues that China is still developing, Europe lacks political unity, and at the time, the Soviet Union was collapsing. So the US still has space to be a global leader, but the way in which it leads will be very different. Proof of power lies not in resources, but in the ability to change the behaviour of states. Thus, the critical question for the US is not whether it will start the next century as a superpower with the largest supply of resources, but to what extent it will be able to control the political environment and get other countries to do what it wants. He brings up a lot of factors that are influencing this shift in power dynamics. Military power is becoming less important, whereas things like economic and environmental power and issues are becoming more important. States are becoming more concerned with security, but it's less about military security and more about having good relationships with the nations that surround you or nations that you would have classed as enemies in the past. Japan, for example, cannot develop a nuclear arsenal, not just because it doesn't have enough money, which it probably would have by now, but because it would look bad both at home and abroad, right? And this would damage its ability to exercise other types of political power and get what it wants out of the global community. There are lots of other factors mentioned: the modernization of technology, globalization, increasing urbanization, and also the transference of power simply from state actors to increasingly rich private actors. The changing nature of international politics has made intangible forms of power more important. National cohesion, universalistic culture, and international institutions are taking on additional significance. Power is passing from the capital rich to the information rich. So after going through and identifying all of these trends in the changing nature of power, Nye finally goes on to define what he believes soft power to be. A state may achieve the outcomes it prefers in world politics because other states want to follow it or have agreed to a situation that produces such effects. This second aspect of power, which occurs when one country gets other countries to do what it wants, might be called co-optive or soft power, in contrast with the hard or command power of ordering others to do what it wants. Soft co-optive power is just as important as hard command power. If a state can make its power seem legitimate in the eyes of others, it will encounter less resistance to its wishes. If its culture and ideology are attractive, others will more willingly follow. If it can establish international norms consistent with its society, it is less likely to have to change. If it can support institutions that make other states wish to channel or limit their activities in ways the dominant state prefers, it may be spared the costly exercise of coercive or hard power. Now, this definition has, of course, been changed or added to, taken away from over time by various political actors, academics, political scientists, etc. But the core of the idea remains the same. The ability to influence other nations through the exertion of an intangible power is equally, if not more, important than the ability to, say, crush your opponents through military might or to stagnate their economy by exercising your global economic power. There are two main points that I wanted to pull out for the rest of our discussion, which was his focus on the idea of a universalistic culture, i.e. a culture that everybody can understand regardless of where they are from, and the idea of an attractive ideology. And I'm taking this not just to mean a political ideology like communism or democracy, but I'm taking this to mean all sorts of ideologies in the way that we express them. So like capitalism, consumerism, anything that ends in an ism. I think there's an element of branding to this as well, sort of like PR and marketing, if you will. How good is your country's PR? And going back to other countries in East Asia, how have you been able to leverage that PR in order to, say, overwrite current or past historical things that make you look bad? I think my favourite example of a country with absolutely brilliant PR is Japan. If I had to pick my top empire of the 20th century in terms of brutality, both in scale and in style, I think it would be a very close call between Belgium and Japan, both of which are very much overlooked today. I think Belgium for different reasons, but Japan definitely because it has leveraged its soft power PR to the extent where people kind of just forget that they committed atrocities so bad that every single one of their neighbours absolutely hated them. And even if the historical record does not justify it, which I don't think it does, at the time there were a lot of people who felt it was fully justified to drop nuclear weapons on this country because they were like, they're not going to stop, they are terrible, we need to get rid of them once and for all. If you took somebody who had absolutely no historical knowledge of the 20th century, who was born in the year 2000 and has grown up watching anime, reading manga, eating Japanese food, and just generally consuming Japanese culture, the likelihood is they would not organically learn any of this information about the atrocities committed by Japan, both during the World War II and outside of that in general. They were really, really bad. Okay. China, unfortunately, has very bad PR. It lacks that universalistic language that Joseph Nye talks about, and it has an unattractive ideology at the end of the day. This universalistic language, I believe, in my sort of conception, can only be developed through exchange of culture, right? Organic exchange of certain parts of your culture, different popular media that can be consumed by regular people and that you consume in turn from other countries, right? So language is developed through communication, essentially. And because China has blocked itself off from the world for so long, it has not been able to develop this language that will allow it to connect authentically with global audiences, as opposed to a country, say, like the US, which is probably the best example of soft cultural power, which spent the majority of the 20th century actively exporting its culture to the rest of the world. In his original 1990 piece on soft power, Joseph Nye has some interesting statistics about the US. He writes that young Japanese who have never been to the United States wear sports jackets with the names of American colleges. Nicaraguan television broadcast American shows even while the government fought American-backed guerrillas. Similarly, Soviet teenagers wear blue jeans and seek American recordings, and Chinese students used a symbol modelled on the Statue of Liberty during the 1989 uprisings. According to studies by UNESCO, the US has been exporting about 7 times as many television shows as the next largest exporter, and has the only global network for film distribution. Although American films account for only 6 to 7% of all films made, they occupy about 50% of the world's screen time. In 1981, the US was responsible for 80% of worldwide transmission and processing of data. The American language has become the lingua franca of the global economy. China just doesn't have that kind of appeal. And arguably some of it can be related back to its media. I studied Chinese for a very long time, and one really easy, good way to improve your language skills is to consume media, right? But no matter how much I tried, I just couldn't get into Chinese dramas. They're just so bad. Even now, I tried to watch some recently and they're still really bad. I love a reality TV show, but the casting is just really bad. The production's really slow paced. And even the most popular dramas in China, they just don't click, I think, with an international audience. There's too many episodes. The language is very archaic. I don't want to watch another retelling of a palace drama or Redcliffe. Say what you want about the cynical consumerism of Korean media, but at least it's polished, right? At least they know exactly what people want and exactly how they want it served to them. Whereas, again, going back to this idea of a universalistic culture and language and way of communicating, China still just hasn't adopted that or adapted to that. And because of that, it's having trouble getting its point across. Now, there is another question to be asked about whether or not China needs or wants soft power. Before we get to that, though, I just want to talk a little bit about how soft power can actually be used, because I think that's an important point in understanding why a country would want to pursue it in the first place. So obviously, in the process of developing theories of soft power, political scientists have also tried to define ways to measure it and how to understand how it can be deployed effectively. So in the article Taking Soft Power Seriously, Kronig and other writers define the deployment of soft power as a state effort to employ soft power as a coordinated government attempt to convince other actors to do as they otherwise would not do, by using instruments that do not directly affect others' material incentive structure. So that's a really important point, and we need to put a pin in that. Okay, material incentive structures. To apply soft power effectively, states must communicate to an intended target in a functioning marketplace of ideas, persuade the target to change its attitude on a relevant political issue, and ensure that the target's newly held attitude influences international political outcomes. This kind of helps us also bridge that gap between what soft power is to the people and what soft power is to the state, and how the two connect to one another. Again, because it's kind of one of these sort of ephemeral terms, soft power is it's very difficult to locate the nexus of soft power, right? Does it lie with state actors or individual actors, or with policymakers? Is it a mix of all of them? Is it something that you seek to use actively, or that just helps you when you're doing other things through the nature of its very existence? All of these things are a bit difficult to define. One author wrote that failure in culture or policy produces a negative attraction towards those policies and cultures, but success in policy and culture creates the attraction that Nye speaks of as soft power. The fact that attraction depends on success suggests a mechanism of norm diffusion based on a competitive model. Countries emulate the US culture or policy practices abroad because of an innate attraction based on success. So that's all very wishy-washy and theoretical. So applying that to an actual real-life scenario that has taken place, the authors of Taking Soft Power Seriously apply this to the US's Hearts and Mind campaign in Iraq in the noughties. As part of the invasion of Iraq that came after 9/11, the US tried to basically change the Iraqi nation into a democracy based on the US's model of democracy. And they assumed that they would just win, first of all because they were the stronger military power, they had invaded, they had technically won the invasion, they were the stronger economic power, and because the US's soft power, which they probably didn't really take into consideration, but, you know, was definitely a factor and was what led other people to support the US in its invasion of Iraq, was so strong that they just kind of assumed that the values, the ideology of the US would naturally take hold in Iraq. But this is not what happens. Iraq basically rejects US culture, rejects US foreign policy, rejects the US. And this is what the authors of that article have to say as to how soft power played into that. While the US was able to compete in the marketplace of ideas, the circumstances were not conducive to persuasion. Research has shown that self-interested actors make less credible messengers, and the US had clearly self-interested motivations to convince the Iraqi public of the benefits of US occupation. Iraqis were skeptical of US messages from the beginning of the occupation. According to one Iraqi educator, speaking in 2004, the Iraqis just don't believe the Americans anymore. Even attempts to conceal the American hand were largely unsuccessful. So that adds two more factors for us to consider, right? Believability and lack of self-interest. So you can add those to the pins as to what defines soft power. Again, to apply that to a more modern day example, this kind of explains the explosion in the popularity of Korean beauty trends. The government has no hand in the promotion of Korean skincare abroad, and yet Korean skincare is arguably the most popular aspect of beauty trends online at the moment and has been for the last 10 years. Apologies to my 99% male listening audience, but this is actually kind of important. Korean skincare has been popularized mainly through influencers and mainly by the brands themselves connecting with these influencers and creating organic content that connects with an audience that has goals to achieve, i.e. perfect skin, and using that universalistic means of communication, i.e. all women want good skin, all women want to look young and beautiful forever. The credibility of these brands is boosted by the influencers who peddle certain products and have no political motivations to do so, even though their financial motivations are very blatant. The lack of political incentive is very important. There's no hand of the state behind it, right? It doesn't feel that way, and that feeling is very important to the success of these skincare brands, to Korean skincare, and therefore encouraging people either to buy it online or even travel to Korea to get Korean plastic surgery. We can compare this directly to an example from China, where they try to promote Chinese culture and language through the use of Confucius Institutes. Now, in the noughties, I don't know if you remember, again, if you're a young person, you will not, Confucius Institutes were very important. Every university had one, all of a sudden. My university had one. I used to go there. I attended the Chinese bridge competition and I came third in my country. Thank you very much. But in general, Confucius Institutes were taking off because the government of China put so much money and time and resources and people into promoting it. However, they very quickly became lambasted as vehicles of propaganda by the state, and as China's image abroad weakened, particularly during its wolf warrior days and its era of hard diplomacy, the suspicion around Confucius Institutes grew until more and more countries sought to just shut them down entirely. Like, there are basically no Confucius Institutes left in the US, particularly in the UK, where they've stopped receiving government funding. Everyone should be studying Chinese by now, based on the amount of effort and resources that the Chinese government put into promoting Chinese culture and language. And yet it never stuck, because that stickiness of the political incentives, the self-interest of the Chinese government is apparent right from the very beginning. And there's even a way that you can sort of balance these two things, right? So, like, I think another good example would be somewhere like Dubai. As the Gulf states move away from their oil dependency, they need to pivot to other ways of staying rich while basically relying on the slave labour of third world countries. So if we look at the type of people who are moving to Dubai, you may or may not view that positively. That's up to you and your personal opinion. The majority of people who are moving there are middle or upper middle class, highly educated people who work in developing fields, who are white collar workers, who are seeking to live more comfortably and pay zero taxes. People who have received a high level of education. There's obviously that underclass of people who go there to work, to send money home, have their passports confiscated and are basically treated like slaves. They're an entirely different issue. Even though they are still subject to the soft power of Dubai, Dubai is able to play on the core material interests of these people. Dubai has been working on its soft power for a long time. If you're like me and you're unfortunate enough to have travelled to Dubai because your cousin was getting married there, you'll know that the wedding industry, the tourist industry, the gold industry, the fashion industry, the perfume industry are really huge attractions for high earning people from developing countries. For example, Nigeria. Yes, I am calling out my own family here, but that's just an example. They've kind of turned that power into a PR campaign that's been able to brand the entire territory not just as something like a tourist destination, but somewhere where you can live and work comfortably, where you can have a family, where you can have a better standard of living. You can afford a nanny, you can afford private school, things that you used to be able to afford in the West as a higher income earner that's getting more and more out of reach. You can still have all of that in Dubai. It's a very strong pivot and it does have the hand of the state behind it, but because it's being promoted through private companies, through tourist boards, through individual businesses, it doesn't feel so icky, basically. It doesn't have the ickiness of a political intervention stuck all over it. And again, this soft power play has allowed people to overlook certain elements that we've mentioned, for example, human rights. And clearly Dubai's current soft power PR levels are at its maximum capacity in order for people to be able to overlook all of these negatives and only see a glittering future for themselves. So bearing all of these things in mind, does China need soft power? Does China want soft power? You might argue that, say, China's pivoting to domestic consumption, therefore it doesn't need external validation. And to that I would say, even if it were true, even though it's not, which we'll get on to, you still need good external relations for a number of reasons. You need good PR because you need tourists, because you need cultural acceptance and understanding for your political goals, because you want to protect your interests in the sake of security instead of having to use your military, instead of having to use your naval assets to go and scare neighbours. Also, just because China is pivoting to domestic consumption, it still relies on foreign materials, foreign labour, foreign business, foreign investment in order to support its consumption, in order to develop its native brands. I don't know if you note this, but coffee does not grow in China, traditionally speaking. They might be working on that, I don't know. The growth of the coffee industry in China is almost entirely reliant on the relationships between those industries and foreign industries abroad, where they actually grow coffee beans. And thirdly, China already has a consumption issue on its hands. I know they're trying to fix it over the next few decades, but it is going to take decades, 20 to 30 years, I would imagine. But it does still need those external soft power relations in order to basically do anything, both at a political state level and at an economic level, even if that's private businesses. Joseph Nye also writes about why it's not a good idea to just dismiss the idea of soft power out of hand. It is not smart to discount soft power as just a question of image, public relations, and ephemeral popularity. It is a form of power, a means of obtaining desired outcomes. When we discount the importance of our attractiveness to other countries, we pay a price. Most important, if the US is so unpopular in a country that being pro-American is a kiss of death in their domestic politics, political leaders are unlikely to make concessions to help us. Even Chinese politicians have been recognising the importance of soft power and have been working on developing the country's soft power since the noughties. At the 16th CPC Congress in 2002, China's cultural system reform was launched. Although not explicitly employing the term soft power, propaganda chief Liu Yunshan noted that the strategic position of the building of culture in the documents of the party's guiding principles underscored the extreme importance of building culture. He added that the power of culture is becoming an important component in integrating national power and international competitiveness. With an eye on soft power, CSR was aimed at making socialist culture with Chinese characteristics a powerful attraction and inspiration not only to the Chinese people, but to the people throughout the world. The Chinese leadership has recognized the importance of soft power in achieving comprehensive national power and has accepted the mainstream academic view that the core of soft power is culture. For the CPC, it has reinforced the importance of building a socialist core value system that can strengthen the cohesiveness of the Chinese nation. It's based upon this unifying guiding ideology that China can expand its cultural soft power overseas. According to one leading scholar, officially and unofficially, the development of the nation's soft power has been regarded as a pressing task and is near the top of China's list of priorities. And again, we see this in the development of Confucius Institutes, of the setting up of expos like the Shanghai Expo, of bidding for the Olympics, of the diffusion of Chinese state media across the world, both online, like through the internet, through Twitter, and also setting up actual media enterprises in different countries in order to promote a good national image of China. And yet, all of these efforts still seem to lack the impact you would expect, given the amount of investment by the Chinese state. So we've already kind of touched on why Chinese soft power is failing, why it's struggling. We've spoken a lot about the lack of this universalistic culture. You know, the Great Firewall really doesn't help that because it means for years and continually Chinese ordinary people are blocked off from talking to, integrating with the global culture, right? And vice versa, it's very difficult for people outside of China to understand Chinese culture. Even if you don't speak Chinese, you don't need to speak Korean in order to follow your favorite Korean celebrity on Instagram. There's a C translation button where you can just translate everything immediately. And if you're a dedicated enough fan, you might pick up enough of the language to understand what's going on. And that's the power of just kind of being around, just communicating, just letting people have chats with other people. Another problem is the over-interference of the state in controlling the image of China. The CCP is very, very good at creating and using propaganda at a domestic level. It's something that was core to their victory in the Civil War in the 1940s, and it's helped propel the CCP into an insurmountable power within China. However, propaganda in its purest sense is essentially the opposite of soft power, right? It's all centrally controlled. It's all communicating a single message, and it's all using a single language that has been defined by the state. And unfortunately, because China does not have this universalistic culture and does not have an attractive ideology, when it tries to use this propaganda to improve its image abroad, it always falls flat. Phrases like win-win cooperation just get a big eye roll from everyone. You're not going to convince countries that have been subject to centuries of colonial rule overnight that engaging more openly with you is going to be some sort of huge benefit to them. Again, going back to the example of the Iraqi war, many of the partnerships that China has made with developing countries around the world can be seen as marriages of convenience, or even the lesser of two evils. China is seen as paternalistic, and no matter how much it works on its image, it's still seen as kind of a heavy-handed bully. If you look at China's Belt and Road projects, a lot of them are concentrated in countries with which China has disputes within the South China Sea. And even though the economic relationships between China and these countries are improving, the perception of China within these countries is not improving. It's not increasing. It's not going up. People don't like China more because China is spending money in their countries, because spending money is not the same as soft power. And I know I'm making it sound like China has no soft power at all. That's obviously not the case. Money can influence things a bit, which we'll get on to, and like you have things like pandas, but again, there's a communication problem here because China insists that it owns every single panda in the world regardless of whether or not that panda was born in China. And I don't know if they have studied the concept of gift giving, but usually when you say you're giving someone a gift, you don't caveat that with the idea that you can take that gift back at any time. So again, I don't know if this is just a communication issue or what, but yeah, it's it doesn't add to the branding package basically. So David Schambog, who is a political scientist and sinologist, argues that China does value its soft power a lot, and Xi Jinping has invested a lot into developing China's soft power, but it's mainly tried to do this through financial investments. So you've got the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the New Development Bank, the Silk Road Economic Belt, Maritime Silk Road, investments of over 1.25 trillion US dollars worldwide by 2025, and also development schemes aimed at enhancing its soft power in media, publishing, education, arts, sports, and other domains. Nobody knows for sure how much China spends on these activities, but analysts estimate the annual budget for external propaganda runs in the neighbourhood of 10 billion US dollars annually. But as Schambog points out, what's striking about China's investments is how low a return they appear to be yielding. Actions speak louder than words, and in many parts of the world, China's behaviour on the ground contradicts its benign rhetoric. So Schambog argues that it's bodies like the State Council Information Office, which to you and I is just the external-facing propaganda department, exert too much control over China's narrative. Their role is essentially to oversee other bodies who produce information that's supposed to be consumed overseas and other sort of external-facing institutions on what the brand message for China should be. This kind of brings me to a post by a colleague, I don't really know how to put that, on Substack, another China writer on Substack, who actually used to work for the China Daily in China as part of the English-speaking correspondent department. And he basically describes how, because these departments are all run by party loyalists who are very dedicated to the party line, and that's the reason that they've been promoted, they don't really have that knowledge of what foreign audiences respond well to. So I'll just read you a little excerpt from what he's written. Untested commercially and attuned to disseminating information to a largely captured audience, state media outlets floundered when they hit the wilds of the World Wide Web. To help, bosses tried tipping the scales. Crude techniques like massive ad buys via promoted posts, bot networks, and PR companies were used by state media editors to bolster views. However, Twitter's changing of the rules in 2019, banning state media from buying ads, and throttling their accounts via tweaked algorithm hurt. Labelling them as state media hurt further. Overnight, viewership plummeted. In the year to 2020, China Daily added 1 million Twitter followers. Since then, it's lost 200,000. Obscene scenarios saw outlets like CGTN, who have professed to have 13 million followers, garner just a handful of likes per post. So why did they struggle so much? The first is resources. While each major state media outlet had social media departments or digital teams, organisationally these departments sat at the very bottom of the hierarchical scale. The majority of senior management had all come up through the 70s and 80s, where the newspaper or TV was king. They simply didn't understand new media. These prejudices meant salaries were as much as 30 to 50% lower for digital departments. Geography too. China Daily's website staff were in a different building across the street, CCTV's the other side of town. For a time, heading social media was akin to punishment, literally in some cases. When one Xinhua TV head was accused of impropriety with a college student in a grubby massages for internship scandal, he was punished with a promotion to the lead the Xinhua app. Far from realising their accounts were windows to millions, work was delegated to junior staff, mainly interns and fresh graduates, who essentially never clocked off. Inexperienced professionals with low morale, churning posts under strict censorship. The cocktail was never going to work. The second problem was content. Obviously, selling communist messages to a skeptical world was always going to be a struggle, but state media also failed due to inherent flaws within the system. It can't be understated how much some believe in the CPC. Not all. The majority of Chinese I found work in media for the love of media, not some ideological mission, but for a minority, particularly management and the content creators, they are apostles of CPC dogma. Management can only climb the ranks having proved fealty to the party. This meant bosses tended to be more enthralled to the party teachings than most, and were often blinded by dogma, to the point of naivety. A viewpoint I heard more than once is, of course rational people will watch and believe us, we are right. As such, there was a genuine confusion as to why content didn't click with overseas audiences. Some looked at swollen numbers a video would have domestically, and the bereft figures the exact same video would have internationally, and couldn't fathom the disconnect. Again, universalistic culture and communication. Schambog adds that, on another front, Beijing is assertively promoting its culture and society abroad through sports, fine arts, performing arts, music, film, literature, architecture, and making considerable inroads. art exhibition of China's rich imperial past have always been popular. China's 3,000 plus years of civilizational heritage may be its strong soft power asset. Chinese martial artists and other Chinese performers also attract audiences, as does China's growing core of world-class classical musicians led by the pianist Lang Lang. Chinese films continue to struggle for international market share, but Chinese authors and architects are more popular than ever. In 2012, Mo Yan won the Nobel Prize in Literature and Wang Shu won the Pritzker Architecture Prize. Even though China's professional basketball, hockey, and soccer teams remain far less competitive than their North American and European counterparts, Chinese athletes are racking up Olympic medals in a wide range of events. But I would argue that these efforts still fall flat. Even when China seems to be having success, there's always some sort of caveat or something that kind of upsets the narrative. In the case of the Olympics, where medalists do rack up lots of medals, China often tops or comes second or third in the leaderboard. The people who win are not really seen as sort of individuals, but more a product of China's very rigid systems for producing talent. And often they remain nameless. We all know who, say, Simone Biles is, even if you're not really a fan of gymnastics. But do you actually know the names of any of the Chinese female gymnasts who often win either all-round tournaments, individual competitions, rhythmic gymnastics, or any of the many other things that China tops in, like swimming or diving, badminton, table tennis? You know that they're good at these things, but do you know who the people are? And even when you do know who the people are, often their individualism, the thing that's allowed them to stand out and be recognised by international audiences, is the same thing that leads the state to kind of almost clamp down on them and prevent them from becoming the stars that they should be, and therefore the cultural ambassadors that they could be. I wrote a piece a few years ago about how stars like director Chloe Zhao or tennis player Li Na are attacked by the Chinese state and domestic fans for their individualism and outspokenness, when these are the exact traits that allow them to become stars in the first place. So as a whole, these things that are holding back China's soft power development are also hindering China's harder power maneuvers, particularly in the geopolitical stage. Something that kind of crossed my mind while I was writing the script for this episode was how Taiwan seemingly seems to have slightly better soft power than China, despite not actually even being able to be recognised internationally as a country. I think you have a few more internationally recognisable Taiwanese celebrities. Things like bubble tea, which definitely originated from Taiwan, have now gone completely global. Taiwan's ability to kind of export its charm offensive democratic model is one of the things that allows it to retain its strong diplomatic position and have good relations internationally despite its precarious position with China. In his article, Taiwan's Soft Power and Public Diplomacy, Gary Rawnsley states that Taiwan must acknowledge that China holds the high cards. The PRC enjoys diplomatic relations with the major powers, international legitimacy, and an enviable amount of media attention. By the same token, Taiwan has far more credibility than the PRC, and its democratic values are Taiwan's greatest soft power asset. Detached from the government and standing apart from its political agenda, actors within civil society enjoy far more credibility and trust among audiences than agencies that act on behalf of the government. Public diplomacy from civil society and among NGOs can be considered a byproduct of a nation's soft power because their work reflects a democratic culture that encourages pluralism, diversity, and charity. They are also largely immune from changes in ruling parties and their ideological positions. For this reason, Taiwan's civil society offers soft power advantages over the PRC, where the government manages the non-governmental sector and therefore lacks the kind of credibility that would make it an agent of soft power. And I think it's this kind of overall soft power image that Taiwan has, and also, of course, partly due to its alliance with the US. These things in combination have probably helped prevent the large-scale invasion of Taiwan by China. Because really there's no reason why China couldn't militarily invade Taiwan. But generally speaking, it would look bad. Taiwan is still seen as a place. Even though they have no political legitimacy, they're not members of the WHO, they can't have a permanent standing in the UN, they're bloody Chinese Taipei in the Olympics, which makes absolutely no sense to me. it's kind of this charming polity that can do no wrong, even though it was a dictatorship up until the 90s, but we don't want to talk about that. The food, the fashion, the celebrities, these are all really big things in China as well. So I feel like an invasion by China in China would also not be a good thing. I feel like lots of Chinese people would prefer a gentler integration of Taiwan, a sort of return home feeling, rather than the feeling that you've kind of kidnapped or snatched this place that was, you know, doing its own thing. An invasion wouldn't just be unpopular internationally, it might even hurt the state domestically as well. And again, this is partly due to the soft power imbalance between China, which is China, and Taiwan, which is technically doesn't exist by like international rules and standards, which, you know, for the purposes of soft power, I guess don't really matter. I also spoke before about how China's lack of soft power hurts its claims in places like the South China Sea. Even though it's friendly economically with a lot of its neighbours and even politically, when it comes to the South China Sea stuff, they're kind of seen as a bully. You know, they could innocently be sailing their aircraft carrier through your waters, but it's always going to be seen as suspicious. Assessing the impact of 10 years of Belt and Road on China's image throughout Asia, Jong Sok Yoon writes that despite substantial investments and strategic use of hard and soft power, China has not won the hearts of East Asian people. In Southeast Asia, while countries acknowledge China's growing influence, concerns persist among intellectuals, the public, and the media, with assertive Chinese actions often generating negative perceptions. In Northeast Asia, anti-China sentiments are the highest globally, exacerbated by rising nationalism in Korea, Japan, and China. China's Belt and Road strategies face challenges due to negative perceptions of its system. As Nye suggests, soft power cannot be bought, it must be earned. For the Belt and Road to succeed, China needs a more inclusive multilateral approach, transforming the Chinese dream into an Asian dream to enhance regional cooperation and appeal. It's easy to see how this spills over into other areas as well. If we look at the example of the COVID-19 pandemic, obviously there was a lot of controversy around the origins of the pathogen that led to this worldwide pandemic. People of Asian descent and Chinese descent obviously did not deserve all the hate and discrimination that they received from people abroad, but it is because of the very nature of how China is perceived that China could not but be perceived as incredibly suspicious and covering up all its actions during the pandemic, not just because in some cases that is actually what was happening, but that's just what people think of when they think China. They think that they're covering things up and that the state is controlling everything and that it's like this shady communist thing. And yes, that is in part due to propaganda abroad, but that's exactly the kind of propaganda that would be counteracted by soft power. People should have been taking the China vaccines as an alternative to the other vaccines that were coming out if they wanted to, but even people in China didn't trust them, let alone people abroad. So this is not something that could have been totally solved by soft power, but it could have helped quite a lot because economically China had the juice to roll out its vaccines to a lot of people. They were basically giving them away to a lot of developing countries, and a lot of people didn't even want to take them during a pandemic where they could have died. In terms of what China could do to improve its soft power, I think there are just so many easy wins there that the Chinese state or state actors or whoever just doesn't really see. I think a great example is movies, and I'll come on to gaming in a bit, but I want to talk about movies first. There was a period of time where Chinese films or films with Chinese actors in them were really, really popular, especially if they were directed by Zhang Yimou. I remember being a kid and watching Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon and Hero and like House of Flying Daggers and all of those films and being like, wow, this is amazing. Definitely one of the things that led me to want to learn Chinese and more about Chinese culture. But if you look at the top grossing films in China at the moment, you probably haven't even heard of most of them. Again, it's the same problem with the media. Even though these things are resonating very well domestically, they just ring hollow for audiences abroad. And I feel like China could easily rival Hollywood in terms of scale, in terms of quality. There are some really amazing Chinese films out there. Raise the Red Lantern, Beijing Bicycles, Farewell My Concubine. All of these are like amazing classics. And then you've got more modern films as well. Like there's this Jet Li film called Ocean Heaven. And this is really random, but it's about Jet Li having a terminal disease, and he's got a severely autistic son, and he's basically trying to prepare his son for life after him. And it's a collaboration project, I think, with a Taiwanese director and a mainland director. And it's got, people, Jet Li is not from China, but he is Chinese, and it brings lots of different elements of the Chinese diaspora together. And I feel like those sorts of projects could be China's strength, because they are constantly harping on about how there's this one China, and always trying to bring the Chinese diaspora closer to home, and also communicate that message to the rest of the world that Taiwan is part of China, Hong Kong is part of China, Singapore's got a lot of Chinese people in it. I feel like movies, Chinese Hollywood, if you will, would be a really easy win and quite a good investment for the government to do as well. This would require, obviously, the CCP and the state to take a step back and let go of the reins, let directors, producers, script writers really show their stuff and be able to promote themselves abroad as well. The aim is to make China approachable and accessible. The reason that people are confident moving to Japan or South Korea is because they feel like they already understand the culture through the media. They don't have to go there first. They've already seen all these places. They already understand the people. And media is a really, really huge part of that. I think the recent visit of the streamer IShowSpeed gives a more organic lens to a lot of people, and really open their eyes up to what China really looks like. I think a lot of people didn't realise sort of how modern China is, how big some of the cities are, what the people are like. But when I was talking with my husband about IShowSpeed's visit to China, I realised the irony of it, which was that he asked me, oh, but wasn't it all state-sponsored? And I realised that a lot of people even think that this organic visit, it was this guy's choice to go, and yeah, he met a few officials, but most of his trip he kind of did by himself, and it was part of like a bigger world tour that he did. People still think that it was set up by the government and that it's being run by the Communist Party or something. And you just wouldn't think that if somebody had done this big tour of South Korea or Japan. And it just goes to show that China is lacking that accessibility, that kind of vulnerability, right? That openness. Because when you go to China as a foreigner, China is actually very open. I never experienced any racism when I lived in China. If you're just listening to this, I am a half-black woman, and I never experienced any discrimination. People made comments or like they asked questions that you wouldn't necessarily get, but it was more out of curiosity. I had people taking my picture, but never really without permission. That only happened once or twice. It's mainly people just talking to me. Ironically, this is probably due to the communism. Chinese people don't have that sense of superiority that comes with cultural hegemony that has infected other countries. So that's a huge soft power draw, I think, that a lot of people don't know about China. Like, it's fairly easy to just get along and be a foreigner in China, especially if you speak decent Chinese. It's easy as pie. That is something that China actually has over these other countries. But again, leveraging it and understanding how to promote that and how that works is something that the state has yet to learn. So final point about what China could do to boost its soft power. I think that the major win recently of the video game Black Myth Wukong just goes to show that there are really obvious wins out there for China, for the government, that they don't even have to do that much to promote, really. So for those of you who don't know about this game, Black Myth Wukong is China's first AAA rated game, and it's actually propelled its developers, who are called Game Science, to the top rank of gaming companies in the world, despite the fact that before this, all they had done was mobile games. So this is their first sort of PC and console game, and it's immediately this massive hit. It's more like an RPG, which is like a role-playing game where you travel around and you are trying to get somewhere, right? There's like a story for you to follow. And because it's story-based, it introduces a lot of the myth of Journey to the West, which is one of China's classical novels. And because of that, a lot of foreigners who have played the game, who love the game, have essentially been promoting Chinese culture knowingly or unknowingly. It also introduces elements of China's landscape, China's religion, China's traditional Chinese cultures and ideologies as well. It features real world locations as well, so it features the locations of real temples that exist in China today. And most importantly, it's a video game, so it's got that universalistic culture built into the system already. The medium is the message in this case. We all know, what an RPG video game looks like. All you need to do is kind of slap your own character, your own world design and world building, and your own story on top of it, and put the player into it. And if it's a decent enough story with a decent enough mechanic, and good enough gameplay and a good frame rate, then it's going to do well, basically, which is exactly what's happened here. It doesn't have the hand of the state in it, which is so important. I cannot stress enough how much the CCP needs to stop interfering with its soft power mechanics. And its growth and its spread were organic. So there is a think tank. You know how I feel about think tanks, but I'll reference one just this once. There's a think tank called the Centre for International Governance Innovation, and they released a short paper exploring the importance of Black Myth Wukong to China's soft power. China's government has direct control over the video game industry, overseeing its development and release. Despite once tightening restrictions on video games and labelling them spiritual opium in 2021, the government has generally supported the growth of game industries with Chinese national characteristics such as traditional Chinese cultural elements, values, and narratives. Scholars argue that current Chinese diplomacy is increasingly shaped by digital soft power, such as video games, particularly esports, which are viewed as non-state actors. This notion refers to the growing influence and power of technology companies rather than national power in shaping global standards, civil society, social movements, and political influence by participating in de facto digital governance across borders and counties. The Black Myth video game marks a significant transition from producing consumption-driven games, aiming for pure entertainment and revenue generation, to creating culturally rich and globally impactful products. Since August 2024, a large number of Western YouTubers have created video content explaining the main characters, bosses, and more importantly, relationships between Journey to the West and its Buddhist philosophy as reflected in the game. Some of these YouTubers' series on the game's storylines, characters, and scenes have garnered millions of views. Aligning with the above analysis, Black Myth Wukong is currently functioning as a non-state actor, which includes users, stakeholders, for example the developers and investors, and the game platform itself. However, there's no indication that the parent company Game Science intended for the game to hold significant soft cultural value. Its popularity also stems from Black Myth Wukong's cultural value based on localized narratives and Oriental philosophy, representing an intentional national strategy to promote Chinese culture as a product for global transmission that can receive international interest. And I think that kind of nicely wraps up what I've been trying to say this whole time. Give creative people space. Give talent the room to express themselves. Give media the chance to reach other countries and other peoples. Let people hear the truth about China. You don't need to tightly control every single narrative. Believe it or not, the more negative things you let get out, the more accepting people will be of them, because they're kind of like, yeah, I get it. When TikTok was down and people went on to Red Note, and, there was that exchange of the good and bad about the US versus the good and bad about China, people grew to understand each other better because they were treating them as peers, not as the other, right? And that can only happen if you let your guard down and let people see the real you. And that's kind of, to me, really is what soft power is. You put everything out there, the good, the bad, the ugly. You let people take it in, and people will accept you at the end of the day, unless you're a brutal regime. And as I pointed out, some of the brutal regimes are getting away with it, okay? You can still promote the good things more than the bad things, but the point is that you let people in, you have this openness, and, you make yourself attractive through that openness. But you can only do that if you put yourself out there, and you too try and learn this universalistic cultural language. You too try and communicate in a way that people have been communicating with each other. The whole point of soft power is that it's organic. It's not state-led. It doesn't emanate from the center. It's kind of weird and ephemeral and you can't really grasp it, but you can manipulate it, but you've got to do it without the icky stickiness of being a state actor that is trying to obtain a certain specific goal on the geopolitical stage. So if you can figure that out, you'll be absolutely fine. But that is it for this episode, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did enjoy it, please feel free to like it, share it, subscribe on whatever platform you're listening on. I have a Substack as well. I have a Buy Me a Coffee if you want to support my efforts. I've been recording this for 2 hours now. It is such a hot day. I'm so hot. I feel like I'm sweating. I need to go. But yeah, thanks very much. And I will see you again in the next one. Bye-bye.